Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good to see you. Robin, thanks for the invitation to teach today. And thanks for the introduction. Fun begins evidently next week, so today is going to be a lot of no fun. So we're going to try to learn some things, but I hope it's bearable. It's always a pleasure for me to be here and to teach at First Presbyterian Church in Salisbury. I want to do everything I can to help this church because this church does so much for the place at which I work, which is Hood Theological Seminary. So I'm grateful for the persons in this community who support the seminary, who served on the board, who've taken classes at the seminary. So thank you, everyone in this church, for supporting us, and we just try to repay the favor as much as we can. I want to apologize to the Everyman's Bible class. You've got me on back-to-back weeks now, so you had me last week. After next week, hopefully you'll get back to normal, but thanks for your patience with me for leading your class for another week. I had a great time last week at Bob Lewis Sunday, honoring a former faculty colleague of mine at the Theological Seminary, and of course, your senior pastor. So I'm always former senior pastor Bob Lewis, and I just want to thank Everyman's for your hospitality, friendship, and thank all of you for getting up maybe a little earlier than you usually do, and for making the effort to get your teeth brushed and come on down to church, to Sunday school. I appreciate it. You've got busy lives, and I hope I can be worthy of the sacrifice that you've made to carve out some time this morning to come to Sunday school. I teach something that's called systematic theology, and I rarely tell people or use that term when asked to describe what it is that I do for a living. I usually just say Christian theology. As my wife said, you sound like a dumbass every time. Systematic theology. Start getting into all this complex explanations of what that is, and everyone's eyes glaze. Just tell them you teach theology and ethics at a seminary and be done with it. At the risk of not heeding my wife this morning, I want to talk a little bit about systematic theology, just briefly. I hope I won't bore you, because we need to know something about it to know something about the person that we're going to be introduced to this morning. Systematic theology, get the root word system there. A system is a sum of a bunch of parts that somehow come together and do a job together. So the engine in your car is a system. It's comprised of different components, parts, and the system that is your car runs well, gets you from point A to point B when the engine, the system under the hood is running well. Now, your car does not get you from point A to point B when any one of the parts of that system breaks down. And so you need a system expert, a mechanic, hopefully you can trust to come figure out what's wrong with that system that's under your hood. Well, my job at the seminary is to function as a type of theological mechanic. I need to teach pastors in training the system that is the Christian faith. And that system has a number of different parts to it. It includes us as human beings, includes the church, includes God, includes creation, understanding of history, community. And the idea is everything that we say about each of these parts of the Christian faith should cohere and not contradict one another. So your understanding of God has to correspond or match up with your understanding of who human beings are and what creation is about. And your understanding of the human person, what the human person needs to live a full, abundant, fulfilled existence, has to have some correspondence with what the church is all about. Because if the church as a community does not understand the needs of the human person, then we've got a problem, we've got a disconnect, we've got a breakdown in the system. So my job is to help pastors in training think in comprehensive terms about what the Christian faith is. And if there's a problem in a church or in someone's personal faith, that means something is wrong with some part of the system, and you got to go in like a mechanic to try to fix it, figure out what's going on there. So that's my job. I'm a mechanic of sorts, and I'm trying to teach pastors to be mechanics as well. I spent all that time, and I see some glazed eyes, so my wife was right. But for those of you who stayed with me, now here's the payoff. This man on the screen here before you is a master systematic theologian, a master Christian systematic theologian. If you want to know how to do systematic theology, if you want to know how to think about theology in a systematic way, he is one of the persons that you must read. He is on the must-read list for all persons entering seminary or divinity school, and his name is Jürgen Moltmann. He was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1926, and he's still alive today. He's 97 years old. 97 years old. He did not grow up in a religious household. He grew up in what he describes as a secular household. His parents were intellectuals, musicians, and kind of similar to a lot of the high elite intellectual class in Germany at the time. There was a belief that somehow they had moved beyond the Christian faith, and that they were on to better and bigger things, and that for a person to grow up and to be responsible and to look at reality as it is rather than how they want it to be, somehow have to put these childish things like religion behind you. So he grew up in a secular family. Albert Einstein was his great hero, and he read a guy named Goethe, who's known as the Shakespeare of the German language, and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. So no everyman Bible class for Jürgen Moltmann. He was deep into secular intellectual waters growing up. His plan was to study mathematics and to be a mathematician, but that was interrupted when at the age of 16 he was drafted into the German army. And at the time he was drafted, everyone in the leadership ranks in Third Reich Germany knew that the war at that time was a losing cause. The writing was on the wall. They were going to lose. But this was how insidious that movement was. Rather than come to the table to bargain, to negotiate surrender, they were trying to buy time for themselves. And of course, why were they trying to buy time for themselves? To complete what they described as the final solution. They were trying to delay the inevitable so that they could exterminate as many Jews as they possibly could. Moltmann said, according to his biography, he said, "I knew nothing about what the leadership of my country was up to. I didn't know anything about the final solution. I just was raised a good patriotic German, and I was raised to believe that when your country calls you to serve, you serve." And so at the age of 16, this is amazing to me, because my son is 14, and there's some days I look at him and I'm surprised he can get his shoes tied. But at age 16, Moltmann enters the armed forces of Germany.
My one was 27.
27 is still okay. All right, I don't feel so bad now. So, well, they do eventually come around. So he worked in anti-aircraft battery to defend his hometown of Hamburg against Allied bombing. That bombing killed 40,000 people in his hometown. including his best friend who was standing next to him in the anti-aircraft efforts. So to say that he suffered trauma in the course of his military service, is not an understatement. Later, he was ordered to the front lines in northern part of Germany, the forest called the Kleiber Reichswald. And finally, this 16-year-old had had enough. And one night, he roused from his cot in the military tent in which he was sleeping, and he said, I simply walked forward in the dark of the night in this German forest, and I said, I'm going to surrender to the first British soldier that I encounter. And eventually he walked far enough and long enough and met that British soldier, put his hands up, gave up his weapons, and was taken into custody. From 1945 to 1948, for 3 years, he was a prisoner of war in Allied camps, first in Belgium and then in Scotland. And he was living in a hut with other German prisoners of war. And if you know anything about Germans at this time, or prior to World War II or during World War II, there's no one that loves their country, no one that loved their country like a German. I mean, talk about uber patriotism. That defined what it was to be a German. And they had a lot to be proud of. They had the best musicians, they had the best biblical scholars, they had the best philosophers, the best writers. They were very proud of the culture and the civilization that they were building up. And so the defeat of their nation was, of course, just humiliating for them. But even further was learning what it was that the leadership of their country was up to. And their ally, the British Guards, would post on the walls of the hut pictures from Auschwitz. And they would force Moltmann and his fellow German prisoners of war to stare at these photos. It was humiliating for them, but they said it was medicine that we needed to take into ourselves, because we were under this illusion that we were this great, superior, morally ethical culture that was depending on us to save the world, was depending on Germany to save the world. That was the whole point of World War II, to export German culture everywhere. And that they would be the savior, messianic nation of the world. And then to be confronted with these horrific photographs, as their soldiers would say, look, this is your culture, this is your civilization, this is what it all amounted to at the end. And they said, what have we been investing our lives in? What have we been doing with ourselves, with our life for the past 3 years? Our nation just saw us as expendable. They were just trying to save as much time for itself so they could kill as many Jews as possible. And the greatest civilization in the world, we thought, is now revealed to be the most barbaric civilization that has ever been produced on the face of the earth. He said, I did not know where to turn at that time. My worldview had been shattered, my understanding, my nation had fallen to bits, and I realized, he said, I had no resources on which to draw. What was the way forward for me as a person? What would be the way forward for my country, for my people? Nietzsche was not helping him. Goethe was not helping him. Einstein was not helping him. He was looking around for answers, to plot a way forward. And one day, answers arrived in the form of a Bible that a British Methodist chaplain had given him while he was a prisoner of war in Scotland. And with a lot of time on his hands, he began to read this book that his family had been avoiding for a long time. And he said, in the pages of this book, a new world revealed itself to me and changed his life. What was particularly stirring to him about the book was the account of the crucifixion of Christ in the Gospels. He said, I heard the call, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And he said, if Jesus is God, well, that is a God that I can identify with. Because a God that is abstract, that is theoretical, that is just up in the heavens, looking down on us from the skyboxes, that's not a God that can help me. But a God who comes to us in human form and on the cross cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That is a God that I can get on board with. And so at that moment, he pledged himself, when he would ever be released from this camp, to go back and learn more about this God and learn more about the good news that is disclosed to us in the New Testament. He returned to Germany, and my wife probably doesn't like that, bring this up, because I was watching the Netflix documentary of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and she's like, why are you watching that? Can't you do anything better for yourself? Well, no, I said I loved Arnold growing up as a kid, so I won't watch the documentary. But why I bring up the Schwarzenegger documentary is because there's a moment in it when Schwarzenegger starts talking about the broken men of Austria. The broken men who had come back from World War II, and they were in his town, in his village, and they were disillusioned. They were beat down. They drank too much. They were violent in their home. They caused all kinds of problems in the community. And Schwarzenegger said, that was when I started to dream about the United States of America. When there was no hope on the horizon in my town, I started dreaming about the United States. And Moltmann, like Schwarzenegger and like other people from that generation, they were looking for something new. They were looking for something to arrive onto the scene that would lift them up out of their despair and show a way forward to them. And so he studied theology and then started to develop a theology that would speak to this generation of broken down, despairing people. And what follows now is I'm just going to give you a thumbnail sketch of the theology that he developed that grew out of these experiences. You go to the next slide, the creation slide. In his theology, he reaches back to medieval times, to discussions Jewish rabbis were having about why it is that God decided to create. Now, if you've ever read Jewish rabbinic theology, it is fascinating. It's written in dialogical form. They're arguing, they're insulting one another, they're going back and forth, and you get to read the whole dialogue, and the theology is being worked out with the rabbis in the course of this argumentation, this dialogue. In one of these dialogues, the question is put forth, why did God create the world? And more importantly, how did God create the world? This was a problem for the rabbis at that table in that discussion, because one of them said, well, isn't God omnipresent? Meaning, isn't God everywhere all at once? And they said, well, yes, of course, God is omnipresent. Well, they said, how can something that is not God emerge onto the scene if God is everywhere? Isn't creation different from God? Yes. Well, if God is everywhere, how can something that is not God ever emerge? So the rabbis scratched their heads and thought about it for a while. And then one rabbi says, I assume all these rabbis were in their middle age, they said, well, you know how you've got a tummy that protrudes out? And sometimes when you want to look thinner than you actually are, you suck in your stomach. And when you suck in your stomach, you create space where there was no space before. And so the answer the rabbis came up with is, well, God kind of sucks in God's tummy. This omnipresent God that is everywhere constricts or contracts his being, and in so doing, creates this space for that which is not God, the creation, us, to emerge and then occupy that space. So Waltman's reading this, and he says, I can work with this, and work with it he does, because then he develops an explanation for why evil exists out of this understanding. If God constricts or contracts God's being to make room for something that is not God, that means whatever occupies that space now is operating in a space in which God's presence is not fully there. And wherever God's full presence is not, then that's an opportunity for sin and death and evil to come into the back door. Sin, evil, and death and God do not coexist with one another. Those things cannot stand in the same place with one another. But if God has to withdraw God's self a bit for something that is not God to emerge, then those things can start to come in. And Moltmann says the ancient rabbis have produced what's called a theodicy, which in Christian theology is an understanding or an explanation as to why evil, sin, and death are present in the creation. So creation has brought something about that is not God, and that's a good thing, because God is a relational God. God wants to interact with something that is not God's self, something that is truly other. But insofar as God had to create space for that which is not God, now God has a problem on God's hands. There's something in reality in which my full presence is not manifest. And that was the price for creation, says Moltmann. So the world emerges independently from God, but now God has a new mission to bring that world, that which is not God, back into God's self. And this is where God starts thinking about salvation and redemption, according to Moltmann. So it begins with a guy named Abraham, continues with a person named Moses, leading the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt, setting Israel up as an exemplar nation, that is a nation that the rest of the world should model itself on, so as to lead the world back to God. But then a definitive moment in this history where God's trying to bring the world back into God's self then emerges with the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, God incarnate. God says, if I'm going to bring this world back to myself, I might have to do this myself by coming down in person. And instead of Jesus being welcomed as a liberator, as the figure we've all been waiting for to lead us back to the way the world should be, is promised to be, we crucify Jesus instead. And Moltmann says this is a definitive moment in the history of God trying to bring the world back to God's self. And here's how. The problem with the world as it now stands is as it stood back then prior to the crucifixion, is that there was a real thing that was called God forsakenness. There was a real space in the universe where God's full presence was not yet realized. And when God in Jesus of Nazareth is on the cross, in Moltmann's theology, he is experiencing what it is like to be forsaken by God. When he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In that moment, Jesus, the incarnate second person of the Trinity, is experiencing the loss of the first person. The first person is not coming in to save him, to bail him out. He is feeling the abandonment of God, what it is like to be forsaken by God. And Moltmann says this is important because now we have God experiencing God forsakenness. It's not just us who experience God forsakenness from time to time. Now God is directly encountering and experiencing God forsakenness himself. The good news here for Moltmann is that when God experiences God forsakenness, when God takes God forsakenness into God's self, well, guess what? That's the end of God forsakenness. That's the elimination of God forsakenness. When God enters into that place is permanently changed, and that place is now gone. What difference does this make for me and you? There is nowhere we can go in our life, no event that can happen to us in which we fall below where God has fallen. There is now no such thing as God forsakenness. The worst possible thing that you can imagine happening to you can never separate you from the love of God, because even when you were in that low place, God is there, because there now is no such thing as a space in this creation where God's full presence is not active and operative. Resurrection. The resurrection for Moltmann is the first time in the history of the world where something emerges on the scene that has put sin and death fully in the rearview mirror. Jesus Christ is a preview, is an instantiation of where this whole salvation project is going. And that whole salvation project is for the world itself to be reunited to God in the great merger that's described in Revelation 21 to 22. The end of the Bible is not, they all flew off to heaven and lived happily ever after. The end of the Bible is heaven comes down and merges with the earth. And together, heaven and earth, that merger forms what Paul calls the new creation. And this is the event that the ancient Jews are looking forward to. They saw the created world as a temple, and they were waiting for Yahweh to come enter into the temple and sit on the throne of the temple. And if the whole world is a temple, which is how the ancient Hebrews saw it, they're waiting for God to make God's presence here in this world, in this temple. So that there's a very Jewish ending to the last two chapters of the book of Revelation. God makes God's home here among us with mortals. He is our God, and we can see him, as Paul hopes to one day in his letter to the Corinthians, face to face. This is what the whole thing is about. And Jesus is a little foretaste of that event. In him, the full new creation is alive, because this is a body that is no longer subject to sin and death. So when you look at the resurrected Christ, you are seeing a preview of the future, according to the Apostle Paul. And according to Jurgen Moltmann, next slide. The resurrection of Christ, according to the Apostle Paul, functions as a down payment. There's a term that the Apostle Paul uses, it's called an arrabon, and it's a fiscal term, Steve Fisher. It means a down payment that you make. You know, when you make a down payment on something, you are telling that person it's a sign of good faith. I've got the resources to pay this off. You can trust me with a loan because I'm giving you a little bit now. And that little bit now is a foretaste of the payment I'm going to make at the end. And I'm good for it. That is how the resurrection functions, according to Moltmann. It's God's down payment to us. God says, you can trust me. I'm good for it. I will deliver at the end of time. All this stuff that's going on now, it will be resolved. Justice will be established. Love will reign. It's coming. And you can trust me because I did this for Jesus. I healed his broken body. I gave his dead body new life. I did it for Jesus. I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to do it for the creation. And Jesus is my down payment. You can trust me. So, Moltmann says, we were not witnesses at the tomb in the first century. Other people were privileged to be. But those of us who were not at the tomb that day have been given the gift of the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit for Moltmann is a confirmation that what took place on Easter happened and is real. And when you experience it, it is supposed to give you joy and peace like you have never known, according to the Apostle Paul. Pentecostals who specialize in direct encounters with the Holy Spirit, you might ask yourself, why during worship are they waving their hands and screaming, running laps around the sanctuary? Well, if what they have experienced is the Holy Spirit, they are getting a taste of God's future before God's future fully arrives. And if you get a taste of ultimate love, ultimate reconciliation, ultimate peace, ultimate justice, if you experience that in the here and now, how can you sit on your hands like us mainline Protestants during worship? That should fill you with tremendous doses of enthusiasm and excitement. And you can't sit down, and you must run laps around the sanctuary, and your church must have nurses there to catch you in the aisles when you fall out. If what you're experiencing is the Holy Spirit as described in the New Testament. Moltmann's most important question, however, and I'm going to conclude here. What kind of person does this gospel that he's just laid out, that I've just sketched out in inadequately brief terms, what kind of person does this produce? Well, the average person thinks about time, I think, and many of us think about time in the following way, right? You have past, you have present, and you have future. And in the common understanding of how these three things work as time unfolds, right? Things happen in the past, and those things that happened in the past produce the present. And what we do in the present then determines what the future will be like. So in this understanding, the future is always captive to the past and present. the future is not truly free to operate on its own accord. The future must always deal with what the present allows. Past produces the present, and what we do in the present produces the kind of future. Well, a person who is convinced about the truth of the gospel, according to Moltmann, should operate according to a completely different understanding of how time unfolds and proceeds. If the future could only be what the present allowed, if that is true, then the resurrection is an impossibility. Because a dead body in a tomb for 3 days has no potentiality in it. There is nothing in that body that can bring itself to new life. According to the laws of biology, according to our understanding of cause and effect, our understanding of how time proceeds, that body should be in that tomb now, in whatever decayed form it would be in at present time. But the God of the Bible is a God that doesn't negotiate with the present. The God of the Bible doesn't negotiate with present states of affairs. The God of the Bible doesn't ask the present, well, what are you going to allow me to do in the here and now? What's possible here? Can we work something out? Well, a God who enters into negotiation with anything is not a God. That's something that's less than God. God doesn't give a damn what's going on in the present. God doesn't give a damn what's gone on in the past. God is at work as we speak to make God's future arrive, whether we cooperate with it or not, whether we allow it or not. Medical science does not allow for resurrections. So God has to make Jesus' future happen out of nothing, slowly out of the power of God. And so this pattern of thinking now should be, Moltmann says, should be internalized in us. People who are part of the Church of Jesus Christ, who are part of the body of Christ, are those people who shake their heads and refuse to listen to anyone who says, it can't be done. It's impossible. Washington will never be fixed. Our politics will never go back to normal. The church is in decline, and it's just a matter of time before we lock the doors and sell it to someone else. There's too much violence in the city of Salisbury. The school system is falling apart. We can't hire enough teachers. Well, people who think and talk like that have not encountered the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ, says Moltmann. Because people who have encountered that power believe that the future that God has in store for us does not negotiate with what we can see at present with our own two eyes. God makes ways out of no way. As my African American students said, who are always reminding me, God makes a way out of no way. This is for Moltmann, the essential truth of the Bible. And our job is to put this understanding, this hope that emerges from the logic of the Bible and to put it into good worldly use. It doesn't mean that we just sit by and wait for God to fix everything, but that we take this hope that the Bible gives us and we inject it into real world thinking. We're showing up at school board meetings. We're showing up at city council meetings. We go to work day after day after day, and we sit in meetings, and we have tasks and functions and reports. But everything that we're doing should be infused with this hope that the present cannot block the future that's arriving from God, and that there is no impossible situation. There's no irredeemable situation. Because we live in a world in which a dead man has been raised. We live in a world in which anything and everything is possible. And so Moltmann's whole project is to help produce people who can operate in the world with this mindset. And that's why he's just an essential theologian for anyone entering the ministry to encounter. And I hope I've been able to give a little window onto his thought for today. Thanks for your patience, for your presence, and fun times next week. All right?
Well, I didn't keep up with the slide because you were so into it. You are a teacher.
If you got to run to church or some meetings, that's fine, but I'm happy to stay and talk with you if you'd like. So. There's much more to explore about Moltmann. There's a lot of books. This is just a little inadequate snapshot window onto some rich thought. So,
Anybody have any questions or any thoughts? Anybody online? We don't let them talk very much.
The key question for me would be to ask God, if you could do it again, would you do it? Would you create that space that doesn't have God in it and allow evil to exist?
was it this is Steve? I'm going to send you an application to the seminary. This is one of the most important questions that theologians have asked over the centuries. Why would God risk creating? Or why did God create? We'll assume that God can see into the future and knows what the future holds. So surely when God created, God could see everything that would happen. So, why create? Why not just hang out by yourself for all eternity? You have a lot less headaches, no problems to solve. One answer that has come back is God knew that if God created, there would be lots of headaches, and hassles, and problems, and tragedies, and all kinds. I mean, if we just had an inventory in this room of everything that we have gone through in our individual lives, I mean, we could come up with a huge list, and we could ask God, what about this? Was it worth it? Was it worth it? Was it worth it? The answer that has come back from theologians over the centuries is God knew that one day we would see that it was all worth it. We're not yet there where we can see definitively or know definitively that it was all worth it. But once we enter into that redeemed space that Paul called the new creation, that Jesus called the kingdom of God, we will look back and say, yes, it was all worth it. And we're glad that God decided to go ahead and create. Now, tell that to someone who has just lost a child from a drunk driver. Tell that to anyone who has experienced terrible tragedy. And you say, one day you'll see that it was all worth it. We're taught in seminary not to play that card in a moment of pastoral care and crisis. John Calvin was one who said that you should play that card. He believed that to have trust in God is to not know exactly reasons why everything happens the way it does, but to have faith and confidence that when you meet God face to face, you will realize, you will understand, you will accept, and you will praise God. we're in this space from the Apostle Paul where we see through a lens darkly. We can't see the whole picture. The New Testament is insistent that we need to hang in there because it will all be revealed to have been worth it. But that's not a payoff that we get, or that's not an understanding we get until the end. And that is what is frustrating about the Christian faith. A lot of it is wait and see what God will do. And this requires a lot of patience and requires a lot of discipline. And it's what frustrates people, the average person, I think, about the Christian faith, this aspect of it. But it's unavoidable given the structure of the way the New Testament thinks and operates. I think that's all I got for it, Steve.
Good,
Okay.
very good.
Do you not think that there are in our lives glimpses of what God can do? That there are sometimes when we see that understand.
In a world in which the new creation is knocking on our door, when it is about to arrive, Mohan says you should see signs and glimpses of this inbreaking new creation. You will not see it definitively have it, but you will see signs of its presence. If someone turns their life around, if someone is in a bad spot in their life and is able to come out of it and move forward into the present, when you see compromise happen in the Senate, the House of Representatives, the state legislature, glimpses of hope. The problem is, I guess we don't often think that we see enough of that. And this is the charge of atheists. Well, if the world is getting fixed, we really need to see more evidence of it. We have these signs, these occasional signs of new creation emerging around us. And we also, as Christians, have the gift, the power of the Holy Spirit, which is confirming that God is faithful to the promises that God keeps, and that the central promise is that everything is going to be fixed one day. It makes it difficult to be a Christian because, as one theologian said, you are looking through bifocal lenses. Out of one lens, you're seeing the death and decay, the tragedy, the frustration. Out of the other lens, you're seeing the promise of grace and justice and mercy and reconciliation. And when you look out at the world, you have to look at the world through both sets of lenses. If you just look over one lens, then you just become cynical. The world reality is one damn thing after another. Nothing's ever going to get better. But if you just look at the hope lens all the time, then you're overly optimistic. You're an idealist who doesn't look square in the eye at the reality of the world, and you're really no good to anybody. So the kind of Christian that Moltmann wants to develop, and the Apostle Paul wants to develop, is someone who can look through both lenses simultaneously. That's the person who injects hope into worldly situations and worldly thinking. So I see signs of it all the time, but you have to have the theological imagination that's cultivated by places like First Presbyterian to see signs of hope as they emerge on the horizon. It's an excellent question. Thank you very much.